All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA UK MOD panel discussion entitled India and Post-COVID Global Competition, Everything You Need to Know. I'd also like to thank today's panelists, Milan Vaishnav, Tanvi Maidan, Rudra Chaudhuri, and Walter Ladwig for taking the time to present in today's panel discussion. So before we begin, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the panel. So throughout the briefing portion or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has 2 overlapping speech bubbles and 1 has a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before you address your question. And if you'd prefer for your name to not be recorded, you can also submit your questions anonymously. Also feel free to vote on the questions that you would like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to today's moderator, Dr. Nicholas Wright, to begin today's panel discussion. So Dr. Wright, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. So the first thing I'm going to do is start with an apology to all of the panelists. So I've said that this is going to be everything you need to know about India and post-COVID global competition. That's obviously a big task, but if anyone can do it, this panel can do it. They really are the A-team of India specialists, I would say. And why is it important to understand what's happening with India? So obviously India is very big. India is a vast country that is important not just on a regional scale, but also on a global scale. It's important for global strategy. You know, just if you think a couple of years ago, when Pacific Command in the US was renamed Indo-Pacific Command. And of course, India has difficult relations with at least 2 of its neighbours. In June this year, for example, the first time in decades, there was a fatal incident on the India-China border. And India is also really important when you start thinking about technology competition. We only need to think about the competition between Chinese or US-based, essentially, apps to recognise how critical India will be in terms of lending weight to one or the other of these 2 developing sort of technospheres. So India is very big, but like everywhere else in the world, India has been massively affected by COVID. And you can think about COVID in so many different ways, epidemiologically, economically, politically. But COVID has been big news. Now, the thing is that as somebody who reads avidly about COVID, I don't really know what's going on beyond the headlines in terms of India. So India really matters. COVID has been a big deal, but like, what has really been going on? So, and what does it mean for the future? So today we're going to try and tackle the question, in the post-COVID global order, what will India decide to do and what is India able to do? And so, as I said, we have a panel of world-leading experts, and the sort of the aim of today is to go in the opening comments, to go from the Indian domestic scene through more regional dimensions onto more India-China and global aspects. And we will have good time for questions. So please, think of good questions. This is your time to ask those critical questions about India. So we'll begin with our first speaker, Milan Vaishnav. So Milan is the director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I used to work there. Should get the name right. In Washington DC. He's written, just wonderful work using innovative and novel techniques about a wide variety of domestic Indian concerns. So, Milan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you everyone out there. It's great to be with you today, and nice to be with with several old friends on this panel. So I'm just going to get things started by talking a little bit about the state of play domestically within India's borders, and we'll try to be as brief and concise as possible, but look forward to your questions and comments during the Q&A. So I think just to kind of summarize the state of play, three kind of stylized facts. Number one, even before COVID struck, India's economy was facing its worst macroeconomic crisis in 3 decades, since the 1991 liberalization. This COVID-induced slowdown that we're seeing, most economists estimate, India's GDP growth is going to contract by 9% or so this fiscal year, has a precursor. I'm not going to talk much about economics in this presentation because that's something that both Rudy and Walter are going to touch upon, but I just wanted to kind of start with that overall fact. Number two, after clinching a historic re-election in May 2019, the ruling BJP of Prime Minister Narendra Modi has prioritized Hindu majoritarianism over economic renewal. This emphasis has shifted somewhat in recent months and tilted back towards the economy, but I just want to make the point in my presentation today that the pro-Hindu ethos is not going anywhere. And the third point that I'll talk about today is that some of the guardrails that we think of as usually kind of protecting Indian democracy, particularly liberal democracy, do not inspire great doses of optimism at the present moment, and I'll say a little bit more about why. Okay, so where are we in terms of politics? I think the real puzzle that many of us are grappling with is why is Narendra Modi as popular as he is, given the slowing economy, given the fact that COVID is still kind of raging, given the fact that India is engaged in a high-stakes border conflict with China. I think the most compelling kind of theory of this has been advanced by my colleague Nilanjan Sarkar, who basically argues, and I totally subscribe to this, that the 2014 elections which brought Modi to power were really about the politics of economic renewal, the politics of vikas, or the Hindi word for development. 2019 has really shifted away from development to the politics of Vishwas, or trust or faith in a kind of great leader. So this is not really about the politics of accountability. This is about the politics of promise and potential. And this is somewhat at odds with our traditional models of kind of retrospective voting. And this trust in Modi, Neelan argues, and I agree, is sort of premised on 4 factors, right? One is the incomparable kind of charisma and leadership that's projected by Modi. There is no national leader who can go head-to-head, toe-to-toe with Modi at the present time. The second is a centralization of authority in the prime minister and in the PMO, the likes of which we have not seen arguably since the heyday of Indira Gandhi in the 1970s. The third is a kind of play for a cohesive pan-Indian Hindu unity that will provide a sense of kind of order in a very a social order that is undergoing many changes and ridden by many cleavages, as you all know. And the fourth characteristic is a kind of erosion of federal differences, right? A desire to put a kind of central imprint on India's kind of model of political and economic development. Now, where does Hindu nationalism fit in? I think we often talk about this as if it's a distraction to the things that the BJP really wants to do, which is, economic reform. And I would argue that's precisely the wrong way of thinking about it. Hindu nationalism is a feature of the BJP's governance, not a bug. But the two can, and I would argue often do, work at odds with one another. The kind of strain of potent nationalism that we've seen from the BJP doesn't just distract from the economic task at hand, it can actively undermine it. And I would just argue that if you look at the battles on this front of the past 1 year, there have been 3 ways in which it has undermined it. Number one, it's sapped the bandwidth of government officials, including diplomats and people in the foreign ministry, because they have been focused on trying to explain away some of these controversial domestic changes. It has intensified feelings of minority exclusion. Sometimes this has broken out into outright violence, like we saw in Delhi during President Trump's visit there earlier this year. But it's also heightened political risk, right? I mean, the Eurasia Group, which is a well-known global political risk consultancy, names Narendra Modi's domestic policies as one of their top 10 geopolitical risks for the business and investor community of 2020. Now, some of these issues have moved to the back burner, but I would argue only temporarily. In 2021, two important states where these issues have resonance are going to the polls. Those are the states in eastern India of West Bengal and Assam. These are two places where issues around illegal migration from Bangladesh, the politics of quote unquote Muslim appeasement have very special resonance, particularly in Bengal. And so the issue here around the BJP's proposal of an all-Indian national registry of citizens that would enumerate the entire population, seek to identify who is here illegally, and either deport or detain them is going to be given a new fillip, even though that's faded into the distance right now. And the point I would make about this is the politics around this kind of new registry, or it's not really so much about the end goal as much as it's about the journey, right? And the analogy here is think about the movement around the Babri Masjid, the creation of a Hindu temple on where a centuries-old Muslim mosque once stood. That was a symbolic idea that powered the BJP for a 30-year period, is finally now coming to fruition in the year 2020. But this is the kind of resonance I think the BJP believes an issue like the NRC will have. Let me just end here by talking a little bit about the kind of larger democratic framework and why I think the guardrails don't inspire much optimism. And I just want to focus here on three kind of macro level changes that I think we can discern. They didn't begin with the BJP, but I do think in some instances they have been accelerated by the BJP. The first is the rise of what I would call the ethnic state. It is very true that insofar as secularism is concerned, so-called secular politicians and parties have been no better than fair weather friends to it, right? They have cynically used the politics of religion when it has suited them electorally. But the transition we're seeing now is not just the politics of Hindu majoritarianism, but is employing religion as a marker of citizenship, right? So it's about the law as well as discretionary bureaucratic practice that underlines the law. So if you think about the National Registry of Citizens, there is nothing in the plans that would de jure discriminate against Muslim migrants. However, we know from evidence in the field how discretionary authority works and how the sort of politics of that practice can in fact end up targeting the minority population. The second trend I think we're seeing is what I would call the kind of rise of the absolute state. So in India today, the state has arguably more power than ever. That power is concentrated in the central executive. The state's formal powers have greatly increased even as the traditional system of horizontal and vertical checks and balances have weakened, right? So legal changes and institutional dynamics have resulted in a state whose authority is increasingly absolute. Just take issues around separation of powers. We have seen, again, predating the BJP, a sequence of events in which Parliament has increasingly become a kind of neutered body. That India no longer resembles a kind of parliamentary system with presidential characteristics, but the opposite, a presidential system with parliamentary characteristics. The dominance of party elites within political parties has meant that individual legislators have very little agency, and that has allowed the executive essentially to treat parliament as a rubber stamp. The second is look at the judiciary, right? Here, it's not so much about court packing as it's been in many other countries, right? Like in places like Turkey and so on. It is really about judicial self-abrogation. Whether adopted, as a survival tactic in the face of an assertive new government, whether for reasons of ideological sympathy with the government, or on simple careerist grounds, right? We have seen that the judiciary has ignored some of the biggest constitutional issues of the day, whether it is the change in status to Jammu and Kashmir, whether it is the constitutionality of new instruments of electoral finance. They've simply just chosen not to kind of pronounce on those issues. The final issue is what I would say the resurgence of the opaque state. We forget that there has been a decade of improvements in transparency in the early 2000s. We are now seeing a reversal of that. And I'll just give 3 quick examples before I end. Number 1 is the decline of the independence, stature, and professionalism in India's statistical agencies. We now put asterisks by many key macroeconomic indicators coming from India. Number 2 is changes to the Right to Information Act, this powerful tool modeled after the American Freedom of Information Act, which has been serially gutted, not just by this government, but also by the previous one. And the last, as I mentioned earlier, is a new mechanism of political giving, which essentially legitimizes a vast, unlimited amounts of political contributions without either the donor or the recipient having to disclose that transaction, right? So this is actually a reversal to some modest gains that we saw on the transparency front in the early part of the 2000s. So I'll just end there, look forward to your questions, but I think these 3 macro changes, the ethnic state, the absolute state, the opaque state, are things that we really should be concerned about kind of going forward, irrespective of whether the BJP actually maintains its grip on power.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Milan. A huge amount to think about. And so next, we're going to go slightly more to the regional level. So, and we're very lucky to have Dr. Ridra Chaudhary joining us from India, where he is the director of Carnegie India. He's also a senior lecturer at the Department of War Studies in King's College London, and has worked with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. There we go. Unfortunately, we need to update all of the bios now, but we need to get an AI to automatically do it, perhaps. And he's going to be discussing COVID's economic effects and how they affect India's ability to shape the region, and also technology cooperation. So, Rudy, over to you.
Thanks, Nick, so much. Hi, and good morning or good afternoon. I've been asked to speak about the effects of COVID-19 on India's economy, its approach to technology, as Nick said, and how in turn this reshapes India's multilateral advance. I'll try to do the best that I can in the 8 or 9 minutes allotted to me. Clearly, what India does and is able to do internationally is directly connected to its internal economic capabilities. India has a crucial role to play in international politics, especially in the following 3 years. In January 2021, India will become a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. In 2022, it will chair the G20. It will need to find a path in the messy architecture of global politics that can be supported by its economic position internally. This will affect every aspect of India's transnational footprint, whether it's to do with free trade, which will also matter a lot more today under the Biden presidency than it has in the last 4 years, its approach to the treatment of data and its movement across administrative jurisdictions or across borders, its advance as far as emerging technologies such as AI and blockchain is concerned, its position on digital taxation, and more broadly, its approach to what might be called reforming multilateralism. So to start with, what is the state of the Indian economy today, and what are the kind of second and third order effects that are likely in the near term? On the economy, and as Milan clearly underlined, the moot point, according to me and the research that we've done, is worth keeping in mind is that India is currently undergoing what well might be called a compounded economic crisis. That is, the shock of the outbreak of COVID-19 and a slowdown in economic growth that predated the pandemic. The slowdown began in 2012. It briefly corrected itself between 2014 and 17, and then dipped significantly in 2019 and 20, almost by half, from 8.3% of GDP to about 4.6%. This was the position that India found itself in as COVID-19 spread rapidly across the world, and India went into a 70-odd day lockdown. Further, to arrest the slowing economy, the Indian government effectively weaponized both fiscal and monetary policies with a view to boost growth, much like many other countries would. But it left little room for economic maneuver as the second and third order effects of COVID-19 are becoming clearer. So hence, and this is, I think, worth keeping in mind, is unlike many developed countries, for India, the challenge is to craft a response that goes well beyond band-aiding. It needs to simultaneously deal with the emergency at present, whilst also initiating long-term structural reforms. India needs to design policies that provide employment and subsidies at present to keep the machinery going, without losing sight of the urgent need for factor market reforms in land, labor, capital, to be and seem to be an attractive destination for investments. This is the only way that India can make the best of the opportunities in the present state of geopolitical flux, shaped by diversifying supply chains, and one in which the wheels have all but completely come off the Sino-American relationship. Whilst it is clear that India's growth engine is directly dependent on its liberalized approach to trade, protectionism, much like in many parts of the world today, is the reality of our times and a byproduct of COVID-19. Half of India's $2.7 trillion economy is sourced from external factors such as trade. So there is an inherent tension between wanting to grow and the need for self-sufficiency. How India squares the circle will largely determine its economic profile in the near future. The second and third order effects are still uncertain, but searching through the maze, I think the following might be highlighted. One, while there's plenty of opportunity to absorb supply chains that to a limited extent exit China and search for new homes, the speed with which reforms are actually implemented on the ground in India will determine the extent to which large manufacturers will move. The government's initiatives at present have prompted some companies, like Apple, for instance, and other technology firms, to move a part of their manufacturing to India. And that's good news for a country that desperately needs investment. But the hope is to be able to create manufacturing clusters in technology. India did this very successfully in the 90s and early 2000s. It created automobile and mobile phone clusters. These are self-sustaining clusters that benefit almost any aspect of the economy, from production to consumption. So the moot point here is, if you were to measure the second and third order effects of the economy and India's ability to absorb some of the diversifications taking place in the world, I think it comes back to some of the conventional issues about reforms back home in India. The faster you reform and the faster those reforms come to life, the more attractive you will be for the companies to invest. And I think that is the tension that the government is presently trying to unlace or untie. Second, limited economic might does mean that in the next 1 or 2 years, at least, India will find it difficult to invest in South Asia, where China's presence and portfolio grows by the day. So much so that Chinese sovereign funds seems to even support individual businesses and industry leaders in countries such as Maldives and Sri Lanka, which is a fairly different approach to development partnerships. India's taken the view, and in my view, wisely so, that an eye for an eye approach to Chinese contest in South Asia is a lose-lose model. Politically and diplomatically, much is being done to build bridges with most of its immediate neighbors, although a lot more could be done. Development partnership is a key aim of the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. But the key question is about resourcing projects and the funds that can be made available for the same. And here, I think bilateral and plurilateral partnerships will be key with countries like Japan, with countries from within the European Union. Under President Trump, there was zero appetite to support such development endeavors across India's borders. So whether it was co-development projects to build roads, connectivity, think of hydropower, unless there was an actual profit motive for an American company, and I can say this quite clearly and confidently, there was no appetite whatsoever in the American embassy in India to support such projects. The hope is that this will change with the new administration in America. 3, India is the largest open data market in the world. More data is consumed per capita in India than in any other open market. The pandemic has made clear to Indian decision makers that this is a resource, as they put it, that needs to be leveraged much more. To an extent, it is this data market that has prompted almost every major technology and e-commerce firm, from Facebook to Amazon and Walmart to Google, to invest in India and also partner with local giants. Largely, this is good news in India, but protecting this space is clearly a key priority for the Indian government. And here lies another tension between the material need to protect or localize data and the realities of the opportunities in AI blockchain, and other emerging technologies that necessarily require sharing data and its movement across national borders. Fourth, and this is something that Walter will focus on in detail, is considering the effects on Indian military modernization. In the near future, and as Nick mentioned in his introductory remarks, the relationship between India and China is unlikely to reset itself in any given way. Kinetic activity, along the line of actual control between India and China will increase. That relationship has changed fundamentally because of a set of tragic incidents in the summer of 2020. But resourcing a modern military and balancing the scales between pay and pensions on the one side and capital acquisitions on the other will be much harder to do today than it has been in the past decade. Further, the realities of a two-front war are much starker today than they were even 9 months ago. It is clear that India will not have the required resources to adequately prepare for this. What will be needed is a strategic transformation of its armed forces. History is rife with examples of how militaries have had to change because of shock or the lack of resources or changes in the opponent's military doctrine. India today faces each of these well-tested scenarios all at the same time. To conclude, and apart from the four broad effects highlighted above by me, returning to the point about multilateralism, I think you can expect India to play a harder role on large multilateral initiatives such as climate change negotiations, a core mission of the Biden administration. India has done well to meet its markers set out in Paris in 2016, but further ambitions will have to be considered against its economic fortunes today. 2, India will welcome renegotiations with Iran and the resurrection of the JCPOA or some such formula that directly benefits the Indian economy, a large importer of Iranian crude. So I think on non-proliferation selectively, you will see a lot of support from India multilaterally, primarily because it directly benefits India's material needs. In the G20, it will play a starker role in the global governance of data and emerging technologies. And I'm quite happy to take questions on India's approach to these technologies, AI, or strategic infrastructural technologies such as 5G later on. It will look to the US, Japan, Australia, and perhaps even the EU that, dare I say, now appears to have woken up to the challenge of China to work alongside it as it designs development and influence operations across South Asia and potentially in parts of Africa. Some might say that India is a country that has always designed its own path, proving its exceptionalism to all those who cared enough in India's future. But this will be much harder today, even harder than in the early 1990s, when India liberalized following the collapse of the Berlin Wall, because of the compounded economic crises that affects both, I think, its imagination and growth. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudy. I'm sure that's going to provoke a lot of questions. So our next speaker is Walter Ladvig, who is a senior lecturer at King's College London. He's published in all sorts of top journals like International Security and so on. He's going to speak today to India's defence budgets, the implications of that for India's military, and he'll also touch on demographic trends and implications for internal security. Oh, I'm so sorry, Walter, you are muted.
Yes, sorry, I just realized that. Thank you so much. So I want to discuss with you all today 2 long-term trends that are affected by COVID that I think will have important effects on India's material base of power. Nicole, could you go ahead 2 slides? Nicole, are you able to? Okay, so the first is economic in nature, and it relates to the so-called demographic dividend. You know, India, we should recognize, is a very young country. More than half the population is under the age of 25. And in contrast to China, whose working age population has stopped growing, India's population of future workers is expected to keep expanding over the course of the next 2 decades. So this has led many to talk about the possibilities of reaping a demographic dividend, where this expanding pool of labor will help spur economic growth and perhaps even facilitate a transformation away from agriculture and towards services and manufacturing in terms of the Indian economy. And we should remember that favorable demography and this demographic dividend has been attributed as a main driver behind the so-called East Asian miracle that saw the economies of Taiwan and South Korea, Singapore, and others kind of modernize in the 1970s and 1980s. Next slide, please. Now, unfortunately, against this rosy picture, I want to talk about a couple of factors that I think are going to challenge this demographic dividend thesis and could lead India to fall short of expectations. The first is the fact that we have a situation right now where millions of young people are entering the workforce on an annual basis and are far outstripping the number of available jobs that are being created each year, particularly in the formal sector. So consequently, over the last 2 decades, India has steadily had youth unemployment rates above 20%. Moreover, due to features of jobless growth, much of the increased employment we've seen from recent Indian economic growth has been in the low-paid, low-skilled, informal sector where more than 80% of the population works. Next slide, or tab forward. Now, the situation is not helped by the fact that a lot of the population growth is concentrated disproportionately in relatively less developed states in India. Tab forward. So you can see in this kind of orangey red belt along the middle of the country, this is where a lot of the population growth is going to take place. And these are also states where large segments of the population live below the poverty line. They have low female work participation rates, poor infrastructure, poor education systems and governance, all of which raises really important questions about the ability of young workers to gain the skill development necessary to harness the potential of the demographic dividend. Next slide. One more tab. And so this issue of skill is really important. The percentage of the Indian workforce receiving formal skill training is low, even by comparison to other developing countries. And there are unfortunately even concerns with respect to college graduates and university educated workers. So you may have seen this story that got a lot of news last year. The global skills assessment company Aspiring Minds put out a study asserting that 80% of engineering graduates from Indian universities were unemployable in a knowledge economy. And we actually see that the unemployment rate for educated youth is actually worse than that for less educated workers, with master's and bachelor's degree holders averaging something like 36% unemployment rates. Next slide. And so this was a situation that was already bad before, as Rudy described, COVID hammered the formal sector. Some of the estimates we've seen suggest that young workers have taken a disproportionate toll. So, workers aged 20 to 25 may have accounted for about 35% of job losses since April, even though they only represent about 9 to 10% of the workforce. So we have a situation in which a high percentage of educated youth in India are either unemployed or underemployed. And some labor economists estimate that full job recovery may not happen for another 3 to 4 years. So given that we expect the Indian population to start aging in about 2035 or 2040, these lost years are a really notable setback. I think at a minimum, a failure to create sufficient jobs and impart skills to young workers may mean that India misses out on a significant and important aspects of its economic potential. But beyond that, you don't need to be a political scientist to know that a mass of unemployed, educated youth whose reality has fallen far short of their expectations for a good life are not conducive to political stability. I don't think these kind of trends bode well for a reduction in the kinds of sectarian or exclusionary politics that Milind was talking about, not to mention populist political appeals. I think we should at least keep an eye on this situation for implications for internal security. Just 10 years ago, India's internal insurgencies were being discussed by the prime minister of the day as the most significant security threat facing the country. Now, these problems have been largely tamped down in recent years, in no small part due to a massive expansion of the country's paramilitary police forces, but the underlying kind of causes and drivers have not necessarily been addressed. So there is the possibility that this sort of unemployed educated youth bulge could be tinder that helps reignite some of these smoldering conflicts, which would then, of course, redirect both resources and political attention to internal security issues instead of to India's role in the broader Indo-Pacific. So in short, I think this phenomenon is worth watching and tracking, both for its potential effect on the Indian economy, which is, of course, the country's material base of power, as well as its implications for domestic politics and internal security. Okay, if we go forward to the next slide. So now I want to pivot and talk about Indian defense spending and the broader role in the world that it might enable. Next slide. So the growth of India's defense budget has certainly got a lot of attention in recent years. Depending on what metrics you use, India is now the third largest defense spender in the world, having surpassed Russia, Saudi Arabia, UK, and France. And relatedly, many speak of India as taking a role as a net security provider in the Indo-Pacific, and we certainly see Indian politicians and senior military officials echoing that ambition. When you dig a little deeper, however, I think there are reasons to be somewhat cautious with this kind of talk. Next slide, please. So it is the case that in real terms, the Indian defense budget has grown by just a little under 5% per year for the better part of the past 2 decades. Next slide. However, we can see, if you look at the service breakdown, it is the Indian Army that has captured the supermajority of these gains. And on one level, this makes sense because the 1.2 million men the Army has under arms account for about 85% of the people in uniform in India. However, it also means that the allocations to the Air Force and particularly the Navy, who would be expected to play a very disproportionate role in a net security provider concept, have essentially been flat. Next slide. And the situation is even more problematic when we recognize that the supermajority of the increases in defense spending that have occurred in India in the past decade have been, as Rudy already mentioned, on personnel costs, pay and pension, the latter of which has been accelerated by a significant expansion of military pension benefits undertaken by the Modi government. Click forward, please. So you can see we've gone to a situation in 2011 where personnel costs were a little under half of the total expenditure. Click forward, please. To one today where it's 61% of a larger budget, and at the same time, the share of budget for capital acquisition has actually declined, which is further bad news for the capital-intensive Navy and Air Force. And again, this was all happening before the COVID pandemic hammered the Indian economy in the short term. The defense budget, by best estimates, is set to take a 15% cut this year as the government redeploys funds to its pandemic response. However, the government's already insisted and promised that salaries and pensions will not be affected. So the capital budget will be the primary victim from these cuts. Next slide. And this is really bad news because across the board, all 3 services have already been significantly behind in their modernization plans. Next slide. Both the Navy and Air Force have subsequently had to reduce their force targets in ways that take them further away from the ability to function as a net security provider. And even still, some of these new force targets may be more aspirational than achievable, given the current trends in capital budgets. Next slide. Personnel costs are something that the Indian government is really going to struggle to find a ready solution to. Although many militaries around the world have cut end strength to free up funding for modernization, India is going to have real difficulties going down that path. The first reason is that, the justification for maintaining a large standing army, which sucks up so much in pay and pensions, is due in part to the 2 unresolved border disputes that exist with India's neighbors, both of which, as of this year, are very live, as well as the need in the recent past to deploy the army on internal counterinsurgency missions in the Northeast and Kashmir, which is a very manpower-intensive task. And from a political standpoint, Prime Minister Modi has gone out of his way to position himself as a champion of the armed forces. He's staunchly pro-military, and he's claimed a lot of political credit for the passing of these pension increases that are now proving to be such a fiscal burden on the defense budget. So it's really hard to see how he could easily backtrack or reverse course or pass some sort of initiative to ameliorate these issues, like extending the time and service requirements or creating new short service options that keep people from earning military pensions. Next slide. Look, it's still too early to see what lasting effect, if any, the pandemic will have on the pace of the Indian economic growth. But given that there are a range of competing demands for government spending, including and most importantly on domestic economic development, nothing suggests that we're going to suddenly see a dramatic increase in the share of the national budget given over to defense that would allow modernization funds to grow at a faster pace than personnel costs. You can see on this chart that India has fairly consistently spent less than 3% of GDP on defense, and even hot conflicts and near crises, major terrorist attacks with neighboring Pakistan, really doesn't move the needle all that much. So I think it's pretty likely that this will continue to be the case in the future, which of course then highlights and reinforces the need I discussed earlier to grow India's economy as fast as possible. Next slide, please. I don't want to paint a picture that's completely doom and gloom. India has a capable military, but at the same time, I think it's very important to have a realistic understanding that developing the capacity to project influence significantly beyond India's territorial borders will be slow going. So our expectations for India as a security partner in the Indo-Pacific should be measured. Understandably, safeguarding the country's territorial integrity and its internal security remains the primary focus of the armed forces, which prioritizes the army over the other two services. The Indian government's rhetoric about playing a leading role in the broader Indo-Pacific is simply not mirrored by budgetary allocations when it comes to defense, and it probably won't be for some time. So I think on that cheery note, I will conclude and throw things over to Tanvi. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Walter. I am going to talk about the impact of COVID on India's perceptions of and approach towards China. And one thing that it's important to remember is that this impact of COVID on India-China relations is entangled with the impact of the ongoing boundary crisis that's been going on since May. In some ways, their effects of these two developments has been cumulative. Both have hardened views of China in India. They have reinforced and accelerated some existing trends vis-a-vis China in India, but they've also generated some additional concerns. And finally, they've made real what some had thought of as abstract or even potentially long-term anxieties that India didn't have to worry about right now. When COVID first emerged, there were some signs of Indian cooperation with China. The Indian government, for instance, its rhetoric was quite measured, with kind of no public accusations about China's lack of transparency, as some other countries, including the US, did. This reflected the Indian desire to keep the relationship stable. It also reflected the need to procure certain medical supplies and inputs for India's pharmaceutical industry from China. The need to evacuate its citizens from China in those early weeks, and the need for China and its support to get kind of, for example, loans from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the New Development Bank that India sought as for its economic needs in the course of recovering and dealing with the COVID. But regardless of kind of trying to temper its rhetoric, India's concern about China in the context of COVID was evident at that early time as well. The particular concern was that Beijing or Chinese companies would take advantage of the pandemic and China's own seeming early recovery for at least three objectives. One was the acquisition of vulnerable Indian companies. The second was that China would use this to increase Chinese influence in India's neighborhood through mass diplomacy, through financial assistance, through repackaging debt packages that it had in the neighborhood. And the third concern was that Beijing would portray the Chinese system, use this opportunity to portray the Chinese system and its global and regional leadership role as more effective at the expense of others, particularly democracies, including countries like the US and India. The Indian strategic community was more vocal about these concerns than the Indian government was. It criticized China for its initial response, for its lack of transparency, with some even advocating the use of the term Wuhan virus. What was particularly striking also, and quite different from what you usually hear in India, where you don't hear about ideology, Chinese ideology or kind of ideological differences as being a major concern, you did hear some former senior Indian officials, including China hands who'd served in government, unusually pointing to China's lack of democracy as part of the problem that was responsible for the spread of this virus. You also saw in the aftermath of that kind of initial phase that Indian public sentiment was inflamed. Anti-China sentiment went mainstream in a way that's usually reserved for India's other adversary, Pakistan. You saw primetime news segments, if not entire shows, dedicated to China's role, memes and conspiracy theories proliferating on social media. And despite the Chinese embassy's efforts in India, you saw Indians largely blame China for the origin of the virus, with criticism for the Chinese lack of disclosure, its influence and behavior vis-a-vis the World Health Organization, its sidelining of Taiwan, the quality of the medical supplies that Chinese companies were providing, and what was largely and broadly seen as a Chinese effort to take diplomatic and commercial advantage of the crisis. Now, even as Delhi was putting together, the government was putting in place a response to mitigate some of these concerns, the boundary crisis between the two countries broke out in early May with what India saw as the People's Liberation Army's unilateral attempt to change the status quo at multiple points along the line of actual control, either by hindering Indian patrols in these regions or by establishing or trying to establish a permanent presence in areas that both sides claim. Now, was the boundary crisis linked to the pandemic? There continues to be much debate about the motivations for the PLA's initial moves. But COVID-19 could have had an impact. It might have had an impact at both a strategic and operational level. At the strategic level, the boundary crisis was part of a broader pattern of Chinese assertiveness that we saw on a number of fronts against Japan, Australia, Taiwan, not to mention Canada, and a number of South China Sea claimants. Now, experts are kind of divided on whether this assertiveness, this broad assertiveness, stemmed from either Xi Jinping wanting to show strength because of concerns about domestic and international criticism of his handling of the pandemic, or B, the other view is that this assertiveness stemmed from Beijing's desire to take advantage of other countries, including India, being on the back foot or distracted due to the coronavirus. Now, the pandemic might have had an impact on the operational level as well. The PLA was thought to have redeployed troops from its annual springtime military exercise to undertake its initial moves to change the status quo at the boundary. India had postponed its similar exercise that usually takes place around this time of year. And did not have the presence and matching strength on its side of the boundary to respond initially. So you could have seen that they could have been linked. Now, if you look at these two things together, the boundary crisis and COVID, what has been its impact? As I mentioned, public sentiment had already deteriorated, and it deteriorated even further. Now, even before this year, 23% of those surveyed in India said they have a favorable view of China. So that's quite low. So there's not far for that to fall, but I suspect if that poll was taken again today, you'd see that number fall of China's favorability rating. But you'd also, I suspect, see a lot of Indians who didn't have strong views about China. There was a large don't know contingent, now have a view. The other interesting thing amongst public sentiment in terms of impact is the awareness of Taiwan has increased considerably in India in a way that you didn't really see discussed in public. And I can come back to that if people are interested in what the implications might be, because there are some strategic and economic implications involved. As far as the strategic community is concerned, the kind of combination of COVID and the boundary crisis has, and Rudra referred to this, it's been a real watershed moment, particularly the boundary crisis, but I think the cumulative effect, you've seen kind of a call for reassessment of ties with China. You've seen trust, which was already at low levels. There's a lot of historical baggage in this relationship. That trust has been damaged even further. And that's true in government as well. For the government, they have publicly said that the boundary crisis, and not said it so much publicly about COVID, but that it will impact the broader relationship. They see China, along with kind of not following the rules of the road in handling the outbreak of COVID, now they see China as having violated a set of boundary agreements that the two countries had reached. This combination of events has weakened the argument of those within government who were calling for India to do more with China and less with countries like the US. You've also seen it weaken the hands of those arguing that deeper economic ties and broader connectivity with China would alleviate political strains or buy India time. Or for that matter, those who were arguing that you could keep strategic issues separate from economic issues or telecommunications issues or technology issues. And you've seen kind of this broader concern. So there's been a broader set of concerns, as I highlighted, and some specific ones that I'll briefly say. The broader concerns, as I said, COVID and the boundary crisis, China's lack of transparency, its uncertain commitment to the rules-based order, its growing influence in the Indo-Pacific, as well as an international institution, of course, reflected in its approach to the WHO. The most specific concerns that India has had, and where we have seen policy responses that are much more specific, are threefold. One, Indian concerns have been intensified about overdependence on China and overexposure to China. And you see this in particular fields, pharmaceuticals, the solar power industry, and electronics have been three areas. And pharma has been kind of heightened, and more people are more aware of this because of the COVID context. The second kind of Indian concern that has been intensified is a concern about inroads that Chinese companies, particularly those linked to the state or the party in China, their inroads into certain sensitive sectors in India. And the third is concern about avenues of Chinese influence within India, in some cases with the potential for China to use them for propaganda or disinformation. The response that we've seen from the Indian government so far is a number of policy actions. While India's ban on Chinese apps has got the most attention, the intensifying Indian concerns about all these things I listed have led to actually a broader slew of measures which will restrict or increase scrutiny of Chinese activities in a number of domains in India, including economic, technology, telecommunications, public diplomacy, and education. You've also seen a much more kind of thinking about and a focus on building resilience, some of it military, but also in the economic context, as Rudra had talked about, this kind of balances a number of countries are finding between what do you reshore, bring production at home, where do you diversify your options, both designed to kind of increase India's resilience. You've also seen as a response, India more willing to work, which was already ongoing, more willing to work with what have increasingly been called like-minded partners at the bilateral level, at the regional or plurilateral level. So you've seen a Quad Plus discussion. So the Quad countries, Australia, India, Japan, the US, with South Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand have regular discussions about COVID response and then recovery. And you've seen other kind of additional coordination and cooperation at international institutions. Just to end, despite this, and I can talk a little bit more about what kind of collaborations we've also seen interesting things where the combination of these crises have made India more willing to do certain things, for example, with the US in the midst of a China crisis, whether that's a quadrilateral ministerial, whether that is a naval exercise in the midst of crisis in a way it wouldn't have done before. Just briefly to end, there are some kind of limits and challenges. One which the earlier speakers all highlighted, the crisis trifecta, the national security, the health economic crisis. What does it do to Indian capability in the region? Second, the unintended and unanticipated outcomes of some of these Indian steps to restrict Chinese investments, for example, could also affect, and we've already seen them affect, the options for Japanese companies and French companies inadvertently as well. And then finally, this real question about where, and I think Rudra mentioned this as well, where kind of when the domestic policies fall, what is the balance between onshoring and diversifying, resilience or self-reliance? What will India pick? Because if India's protectionism leads to protectionism rather than kind of more resilience, I think you'll see this affect not just Chinese options, but India's options with some of these like-minded partners as well.
Thank you all so much. A really fascinating set of talks. And we have a lot of questions, but obviously I'm the one who can speak, so I'm going to ask you a question first. And I haven't primed them for this, so which is perhaps slightly unfair. But so when, COVID has been around now for in a big way for Europe, India now for eight months or so, and we've seen a lot of things that were plausible early on, or might have happened and could have happened. Maybe Narendra Modi, for example, was going to become deeply unpopular. Maybe the Chinese model was going to become very attractive. I don't know. There were lots of things that were plausible, but some things have happened and some things have not happened. So what I would just ask, if there are any things you guys would like to say that you think we've really learned over the last 8 months or so that we didn't know at the beginning, about how things are really going to pan out, and if anything has surprised you. Because one thing I would just say is that all of your talks it's pretty doom and gloomy, if I'm being honest, listening here, and it was pretty doom and gloomy before COVID, and it's even more doom and gloomy now. So is there anything, and I'm not saying surprise me something nice, but is there anything, so what has sort of panned out, like what have the real world resolved, and secondly, what things have surprised you? Really?
Yeah, so no, I'll just take a crack at this and stick my neck out. But, I don't know if it's something that we would have not expected or expected, but I will say I think I was quite surprised by Indian leadership as far as COVID is concerned. So let's leave the economy apart. Let's put the politics aside. There were migrant issues. There were a lot of other things that happened. But from day one, every aspect of the Indian government has been on message when it comes to COVID-19. They started on the 28th of January, when India put its first COVID-related architectures in place in various airports and other ports and borders itself, and it sustained itself till today. Unlike parts of France or the UK and certainly the United States, there is no debate in India whether masks are good or bad, whether you need to social distance or not, or whether COVID-19 is a conspiracy or not. And I think there's something to be said about that, which is it's not just staying on message, but that message decentralized itself into every part of India because it never wavered on the top. And I think for me, that's one of the big takeaways of COVID-19. Milan talked about what is it that makes Modi still electorally popular in India, despite the fact that materially there's a lot that is stacked up against him, right? And I would say actually this speaks to exactly what makes Modi popular, is that when he gets on message, whatever that message might be, right? He has an incredible machinery that can cascade that message to every breath of India, whether it's radio channels, TV. Every week right now, Modi has a program on radio. He is on message when it comes on COVID. And I think partially, and however you judge the numbers, it explains the delta between the population size in India and the related fatalities in India because of COVID. You can even take that to 10x, if you like, of government figures. But I think that's what leadership has managed to do.
I can add kind of one thing on things that have, I think have been positive signs and one surprise. I think the positive signs have been that I think you've seen some willingness and flexibility in terms of moving away from accepted kind of dogmas or, in India, things that were shibboleths that have been shed. And in terms of actually being able to correct midstream. So I'll give you two examples. On the dogma side, the classic thing, and I alluded to at the end of my remarks, during the midst of a China crisis, the standard practice for India is lay low, don't do anything additional, especially with like-minded partners that would upset the Chinese even further. And you've seen now over the last kind of few months, once it became clear that Beijing wasn't really budging too much, you saw kind of India very actively, encourage the US. Earlier had said, don't say too much publicly, not kind of object to the US, acknowledging US help and support, but also kind of doing things like visibly allowing an American maritime reconnaissance aircraft, a P-8A, to refuel on India's Andaman airline, announcing that they were going to kind of militarize the Quad, so to speak, the quadrilateral, inviting Australia into Malabar, having a 2+2 ministerial in Delhi, hosting it with Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Esper there. These things wouldn't have happened earlier. And the second thing on corrective, being able to correct midstream. There was initially when, there was this huge demand for hydrochloroquine and other kind of pharmaceuticals as well. You saw kind of, the kind of bureaucracy did what the bureaucracy does, is we're going to put export controls because we need to use it, we might run short and need it at home. You saw the system, other parts of the system, recognize that this will send the worst possible message to the world as you're trying to say that we will be a reliable supplier and economic partner. And that, you should look to us. If you start behaving like China, that argument goes away. And you saw India pivot, say, no, we're going to allow the export. We're going to be a reliable supplier, and this is why you should diversify to us. My surprise is actually, and I think is kind of China's behavior, which is China actually had an opportunity, not just with India, but with European countries, for instance. And if you heard the narrative early on, it was about how mass diplomacy could be, would benefit. It would show its model as being, but its behavior, and particularly in kind of the strategic sphere or economic coercion or linking kind of, mass diplomacy to kind of countries, what they were willing to do to China. I think that's actually been a lost opportunity for them. And, they might make some tactical gains in India's case at the boundary. But they have, it's been, overall a strategic loss. And, they're always worried about India getting close to the US. Well, they've pushed India further into kind of American arms. So that's what surprised me, is that that's where we are, 8 months or now 11 months into this year.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, one of the interesting developments we have here is we just completed a major state election in the state of Bihar, which, is home to 110 million people or so, in which the BJP and its alliance were the incumbent and won. It was a closely fought contest, but won re-election. And, many people had predicted that the migrant humanitarian crisis that Rudy mentioned would cost them dearly, given that if you look at the share of out migrants, Bihar typically ranks number one, people who go off to other cities in all across India for work. Now, it's true that the BJP appears to have done less well in high migrant constituencies, but it was certainly not enough to turn the tide, right? So I think it's just another sort of data point that tells you that we are in a we have to sort of rethink, I think, a little bit our standard models of how we think about kind of incumbent performance and accountability. I think the other thing, and I think Rudy probably would have more nuanced views on this, but I think there's a kind of a surprising maybe not so surprising in retrospect, but a shift in the kind of emphasis where you saw a very top-down kind of centralized response in the early days. Modi he was coming on TV regularly, giving these nationwide press conferences and so on and so forth. They had evoked the National Disaster Management Act to kind of deploy, resources and authorities. And now we're seeing much more emphasis on state level responses, right? Now, that could be a simple political calculation of I don't want to kind of own the response, just like we're seeing President Trump do in the United States, really kick it down to the kind of state and local level. But I do think that has been an interesting evolution in the way that the pandemic response has played out politically.
Going last is always a challenge. So the two things I would have flagged have already been mentioned. Essentially, the government's response and management of the pandemic, and particularly early days, I think, particularly during the migrant crisis. I mean, I would have expected things would have gotten really, really bad, much worse than they have proven to be so far. So I think that is a sort of positive that we would see. And then, as Tanvi was saying, with respect to the sort of the response to China and the way that India has positioned itself politically since then, I mean, there's still much more to be done, but very kind of positive news and movements with respect to the Quad, with respect to other international partners, not just the United States. I think that's definitely been a positive response.
Thank you very much. So now I'm going to use the wisdom of the crowd and go with our most popular question. So therefore I have to do the least thinking. So the most popular question is, so if the educated, in inverted commas, unemployment rate in India is so high, and they may need to look overseas for satisfying and valuable work, what are the medium to long-term implications to India of losing these workers and expertise?
Is that, would you like me to, I could come in on that first?
I think, yeah, given that you were the, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is I think the issue here is educated in inverted commas, because this is the real crux of the issue. We're talking about a youth population where people may be, educated in terms of having a paper degree that says it's worth something, but whether they're actually employable or how employable they are is an open question. In the interest of being a little more positive, in comparison to the engineering example, the Confederation of Indian Industries has done some surveys recently, and they suggest that it's only 60% or 50% of MBA graduates or computer scientists who are unemployable. So there's a potentially slightly better picture there. But this is a real cost to the country and to individual Indian families, because we're talking about situations where people have saved and put resources for education in hopes of giving their children a better life. That doesn't materialize. They've spent money on an education that doesn't really seem to get them anywhere. So with this section of the population, I don't think they'd have many prospects to go abroad unless you're talking about kind of physical labor, in the Gulf somewhere or something like that. It's a really bad, heartbreaking situation.
I would just say one additional thing on if you look at past experience, I think there has been somewhat of a silver lining. For instance, if you look at the work of Devesh Kapoor, who studied kind of Indian migration more than most, the counterintuitive response he puts forward is that the positive selection of Indian migrants on account of education has actually helped Indian democracy in some ways, because it has created more political space for previously excluded social groups. And so because highly educated Indian elites actually have a viable exit strategy, they're less likely to kind of resist political power on home that comes from like the enfranchisement and mobilization of kind of what they call the subaltern castes. The other thing too is that the education and training abroad when people come, particularly at the graduate level, I think has played an important role also in providing kind of positive flows of expertise and talent back to India, right? Which can have positive spillovers when it comes to things like Indian economic integration, investment funding, remittances, obviously, and also, frankly, having a positive impact on India's global image and how India is perceived. I'd argue that, if you look at the case of the United States in diaspora, that is one of their main contributions over the past, quarter century.
Let me just mention a kind of a COVID-related matter here, though it preceded COVID, which is, while, India is in some ways exported part of its jobs problems for a number of years, over the last few years, and COVID's only going to accelerate, is the environment abroad in key countries where Indian migrants would go has become much tougher for immigration, whether that's the UK, whether that's the US, whether that's Singapore for that matter, or Australia. And so, and COVID has made that the case even in the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, or the Arabian Gulf, whatever you prefer, where a number of migrants go. Now, this will have, and something to watch in the next couple of years is what kind of effect will that have, not just on those job options abroad, second on remittances. Third, India has wanted to put this in any trade deal, kind of access for its labor market access is something India has wanted in every trade deal, and it's made it tougher to get these deals. So just some things that are related to kind of especially COVID, which I think is going to be a hardened environment for that.
And I mean, related to the trade issues that you were just discussing. So this is a question from Matthew of DE&S. So with India a notable absentee from the recent ASEAN free trade deal, this has now placed China as the economic driving force in a trading bloc that makes up a third of the world's GDP. How do you think this will impact India's ability to maintain its position as a regional economic power? Are we likely to see a resurgent China using more soft power to reduce the ability of India to fund its military, making annexation of disputed territories easier? You obviously don't have to answer, but there are multiple parts, so you don't have to tackle the whole thing.
I can jump in on one part. I mean, just on the RCEP question, I don't think we should jump to the conclusion that India at its present economic state not joining RCEP is necessarily a negative and that it will edge India out of the trade game altogether. And I've made three very quick points. One, I should just say is that I believe in free trade. I think that I and many others thought that India should join the RCEP, but in a very different context, right? In a context where India's basic factor markets are much stronger than they are today, where investment is still keeping in, and where the engine of growth is still going. I think in the last 6 months, it was very clear that none of this was happening because of the kind of compounded crisis that we talked about. So not signing RCEP is not necessarily a disadvantage to India. Also, it's worth keeping in mind that if you signed RCEP, you would also have to sign up to a number of agreements by which the Chinese could essentially keep flooding the market. One of the key aims of India with regards to China since at least 1993 has been to fix the trade deficit between the two countries, where the delta really grew in the early 2000s and really post 2005, right? So if that is the objective of the Indian state, is to fix the deficit, that objective does not get squared away if you join RCEP, especially when your economy is reeling from the effects of COVID-19. I think, in my view, that is the way to look at India's approach to RCEP in itself. At the same time, I don't think India should cut itself off from free trade agreements or free-ish trade agreements at all. You need to keep an open mind. Look at what China's done with RCEP. It has protected the industries where it is least competitive, and it has opened up the industries where it is most competitive, where it has a market advantage across Asia, right? And that is because it's in the negotiations, and that's also because China has 6 times the per capita income that India has, and it functions by depending on its domestic economic market, much more so perhaps today than international market, although it's very dependent on trade. So that would be kind of my approach to kind of the RCEP question.
Sorry, I just wanted to come in with a quick two-finger to kind of in support of what Rudy is saying. I mean, we have to recognize India has free trade agreements with most of the RCEP countries in position already, particularly through the India-ASEAN free trade agreement. So it's not like we're talking about India is locked out, completely cut off from any of these economies. There are degrees of which, access and other can be granted, as Rudy talked about, but it's not that India has no options or is completely separate from these economies now.
The one thing I'd say is, it's not about RCEP. I think it is about India's approach to trade. And there is an opportunity for India at this moment when a number of kind of multinational companies, but also governments are thinking about their over-dependence on China. And so you are, even if not alternatives to China, you are having another kind of thinking about China plus one strategies. But if India has to be that choice, and so far the conversation has been about, we want to be part of supply chains. And so I think the discussion needs to recognize that these supply chain discussions are linked to the trade discussions. After all, these companies want to export and not just produce for India, which has usually been the argument made in India. Come make here, you have a large market. We haven't seen signs of that yet, but perhaps the combination of RCEP going through a new Biden administration that will figure out its own trade approach, the UK perhaps going to India with, even if not a trade agreement proposal, an investment agreement, that it will get some of this thinking going on about what India's approach to the global economy looks like. With Australia and Japan, they've started some discussions on supply chain resiliency. But recognizing, I think, that these things, the investment, trade, supply chains, are linked and not distinct things where you can move on one and not the others.
I would just say, if you look at the question and you substitute the United States for the word India, the question would still stand, right? I think there is a big question about the U.S. role, which has resonance in New Delhi. I think when the U.S. indicated its intention to withdraw from TPP, you had two simultaneous reactions in Delhi that were completely opposite. You had people more on the commerce side of the house who said, we dodged a bullet because of trade diversion and so on and so forth. But then you had people on the strategic side who said, the United States is handing the Asia Pacific over to China on a silver platter. And so I do think there are lingering concerns about whether the United States in this regional economic order, which as yet remain unanswered. And, the election of Joe Biden, I'm afraid, does not bring us any closer to a clear picture on where we might go as a country on that front.
So in fact, can I just ask, and anyone can very briefly do this or tell me it's a stupid question, but, and this is my ignorance. So, what has India done in terms of big trade deals over the past couple of decades? I actually just don't know. Just to put this into context.
No, so the trade deals are primarily bilateral with India, with most countries. So India has some kind of a mini trade deal or a trade pact with Singapore, with Thailand, with Philippines, with Indonesia, and this covers goods and services. It covers increasingly data, digital payments, new frontiers in technology, etc. The large trade deals where it's been stuck for many years is with the EU, for instance. I think it's gone on about 36 rounds of negotiations with the EU, and now they're stuck on wine, import of car prices, and about 6 or 7 key issues, including standards around child rights, labor rights, etc., which is not going to square away in the next 21 rounds. So I think there, unless the EU takes a strategic decision, they may as well just walk away from the trade agreement. The second, which has been, I wouldn't even call it a deal, it's a trade slice, is with the United States. And I can tell you is that the USTR's office is interestingly still keen in this lame duck period to get an agreement done. And my own view is if India can get an agreement done, it should, because I do think it will get tougher under Biden, even on the slim slice, which is trade.
Fascinating. And sitting here in London, I don't get that characterization of the EU negotiations. Next, from Brian Haas at the NIC near DC. What do you expect in terms of Indian investments in defence areas for emerging threat technologies in the next 5 to 10 years, such as in space, cyber, AI, drones, autonomous systems, disinformation defence, and A2AD in the Indian Ocean? Do any of these have prospects for making up deficiencies in traditional capital acquisitions?
I can start on that, and then maybe if Rudy, who knows more about tech, wants to come in. Take up the last piece, sort of the Indian Ocean. I think one of the big difficulties is to do with sort of organizational culture, which is to say the Indian Navy wants to be a balanced force and wants to be a power projection Navy. They have a long tradition of operating aircraft carriers and large capital vessels. And although the present Chief of Defense Staff wants to cancel the third aircraft carrier and has pushed the Navy to focus more on, small corvettes and coastal patrol craft and says that that's all that India needs, that's not what the Navy wants to be. So, you know, it might make sense on some levels to focus on A2AD if you're concerned about the Chinese Navy being in your territory. But we're not really seeing that kind of stuff. We're particularly not seeing it with respect to India's submarine force. The conventional submarine force, which is, of course, a major sea denial platform, is in a terrible state. They're far behind their acquisition targets. The boats they have, 60% of them are undergoing their second midlife refit to try to eke out another 10 years of operational capability. They're already 30 years old. They're hoping to make them last until 40 years. There's no evidence that this is an acquisition priority. And there are, in fairness, those, you know, naval writers and strategists who say, look, we can't achieve our goals and our security needs by simply playing defense in the Indian Ocean. We want to be able to influence the Indian Ocean, if not the Indo-Pacific, and you need a power projection Navy to do that, not one that simply relies on, you know, sea mines and smart missiles and so forth. I know space is a general strength of DRDO, but I know, Rudy, cyber, are you able to talk to that?
I mean, just to make 2 points here, one is, I think there's a genuine tension in India between what it wants to be. So that's essentially between a maritime force structure and a continental force structure. Now, just by structural reasons, it has to be a continental force structure. I mean, India is surrounded by borders which are untidy, messy, and very violent, right? But so I think that is the one balance that, you know, we'll need to kind of sit and figure out in terms of how this goes. And everyone has an argument. The Indo-Pacific and the Quad has given the Navy a lot of ammunition to say, look, that's where acquisition should be. But as Walter, I think, very clearly made clear in the PPTs, is that there's only limited resources. So you have to figure out what is the kind of threat that, you know, you really want to take on. And I think that adds to the question. I think you will see a lot more acquisition of asymmetric material capabilities. And that's essentially to deal with deterrence on the border. That is the realization that conventional deterrence has failed on the 3,488 kilometer long border with China. So now the key question is, what do you do? Do you put more soldiers and guns on the border, which clearly doesn't help? Or do you invest in asymmetric capabilities, drones, etc.? And I think that is where the thinking is going in India. But as I said, the first one I think is a conceptual problem, which can add to a lot of clarity. And I don't think it's been figured out here, or at least I've seen no evidence of that being figured out.
And for the other two speakers, I mean, I'm just, because I don't think we need to confine ourselves just to the military side, because a lot of innovation that even has dual uses these days is actually done in the civilian sectors. I mean, we see that in the US, where the majority of tech spending, tech research is not, even that has fundamentally eventually military uses, is actually done in the domestic side. So, you know, everybody, to quote the 1960s British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, everybody loves the white heated technology. He didn't really succeed, I hasten to add. But so, I mean, what's happening with India and technology and innovation more broadly?
I mean, I think Rudy is the person to answer this, since he hosts a whole summit on this every year, which is upcoming. There's the kind of pitch for Rudy's Global Tech Summit. But I mean, I'll just say this kind of in terms of thinking about dual use. I think, you know, one of the advantages India has is that it does have kind of manpower that's skilled, and it has private sector companies. So you create the facilitating environment, and it has a history, particularly in technology. But some of it is also, you know, kind of, you have to continue to see kind of government largely facilitating without getting involved. Bringing, which Indian governments have not tended to be necessarily great at, is bringing outsiders into these conversations. It's tended to be kind of, you know, state driven. And you know, some of them, especially India's Space Research Organization, for example, has done kind of very well with the resources it's had. Some of its defense, you know, the defense agencies less so, perhaps. I'll probably get kind of email about this. But, you know, there has been a mixed view. But for the private sector, I think to some extent it requires a change in mindset. I think, but this is where like-minded partnerships can also help, where both as a model, so learning how other countries have done this, brought in outsiders into kind of secure spaces. It's not something the Indian government has experiences. You're also seeing interesting things. For example, now the Indian Defense Innovation Unit liaising and having a conference with the US Defense Innovation Unit. You're seeing these conversations between India and Australia, India and Japan, You could have them with India and European countries as well. No reason not to. So I think some of it's going to be learning. I think the raw materials are there, and you've also seen some experience. The good example that people would give is the airline industry. Even in India, the Tatas, who developed Air India, this was something that also helped out. It was quasi, there was some kind of dual use, at least skilling that came from that that you did see. So it's not that it can't be done, and I suspect even in the US we will see dual use arguments being made, from everything for investments in R&D and innovation to why we need to upgrade highways is because we're competing with China, just like Eisenhower did. So I think you're going to see combinations of that in India, and I think this is a space for all these like-minded coalitions, issue-based coalitions, the T12, the D10s that people have proposed. It's one way of actually shaping the Indian discussion on this too.
I mean, just to add there, I'll just make 3 quick points. One is 2020-2021 is a critical year for India. It's the year in which India's digital architecture will actually be put in place with the force of Parliament. There's a privacy bill that is being considered, which will possibly become law sometime in the early part of 2021. That is basically India's approach to GDPR, right? So it's our own version of GDPR in a sense. That means that there will be some degree of localization of data that will affect relations with the EU. It will affect relations with the United States, as it already does. Data is a key part of the trade stack at the moment with the USTR in the United States. Once you get over that, the cooperative elements, the positive elements, I think will be in emerging technologies. You're already seeing a lot of cooperation on AI, a lot of discussion on working together on blockchain. And there's a dual use aspect to data as well, because clearly a lot of the data sets that you curate, that you use for civilian purposes, can also be used for military purposes. And I think that is a debate that is yet to happen. 3, and this is a point that goes back to trade, I think as a globalist, the net positive of all of this is more investment that is coming into India in the tech field. There's a huge amount. Facebook put about $6 billion, Google put $10 billion. And the more you see that merger and acquisition of foreign companies working alongside Indian champions, you will see an effect on India's approach to trade. There is no way these companies put $10, $20 billion into India, knowing that India is going to localize or gate all its data. That's the only reason they're putting money in. So I think you will see an effect over there. And lastly, I think some of the emerging areas, which is interesting geopolitically, is you are seeing some arguments around digital currencies. And a lot of this is on the back of the People's Bank that is at the cusp of launching its own digital currency, ostensibly to dislodge the dollar, which will never happen. But I think there is a bit of a debate, and there you can see Quad and like-minded countries, central banks getting together and thinking about central bank issued digital currencies that follow, quote unquote, a democratic standard.
I'll just say one quick thing. I'm the least qualified person on this panel to address this issue, but just refer the audience to recent work by 2 economists, Soumitra Chatterjee and Arvind Subramanian, who is the former chief economic advisor, which I think upends a lot of myths that we've had, which kind of bring together the skills innovation debate with the trade debate. And what they show is essentially, if you look at the boom years of the Indian economy getting in the early 90s, India has the 3rd highest growth rate in terms of overall exports, particularly in manufacturing, which has been crucial to the overall growth performance. So we typically don't include India in the category of exemplars of the export-led growth model, but in fact it fits. However, that has been disproportionately based in high-skilled manufacturing exports, right? So that has been maybe a kind of a necessary condition for dynamism, but maybe not sufficient, because the counterfactual exercise they run is, we're seeing about $140 billion in missing unskilled manufacturing economic activity every year. So this lopsided approach does have its toll.
So, and also just to be clear, that predates the heyday of the internet, even the internet, let alone all of this latest stuff. You're saying that was before all the internet.
Yeah, it's basically from 91 on.
Interesting. So speaking of collaboration, this is from Peter Zwack. How How important is the Indian military are arms purchased from Russia? Does India see Russia as balancing China regarding Indian security concerns?
I'm happy to start off on that, and I would say significantly important. I mean, we celebrate the fact that I think the figure, Tanvi can correct me, since 2008, the US has now done about 18 billion worth of deals with India. Russia's doing that in about every 2 to 3 years. The US provides sort of high-end enabling technologies, maritime patrol aircraft, high-end cargo planes, and so forth. But if you look through the Indian military's inventory, frontline fighter jets, tanks, designs for their modern cruisers and destroyers, they're all Russian. There's a comfort level in dealing with Russia. There's a degree to which the capability cost trade-off is favorable to India. And so that's not going to go away. As frustrating it is for American audiences to hear, that is going to be an enduring relationship, also because it's an important political relationship. Although I would argue it does not have the economic or the people-to-people depth that the US-India relationship has. It has longevity. It's long been seen as Russia being a sort of reliable UN Security Council veto that India could potentially draw on. And I think going back to the question about China, I mean, one of the things that we have to think about from an Indian standpoint is that, you know, they see Russia as potentially being an asset vis-a-vis China, right? No one sitting in Delhi wants to see Russia continue to function as a de facto Chinese vassal. And their belief is that if there could be more daylight between Beijing and Moscow, if there were some degree of concern that people in Beijing had across their border with Russia, that would be good geopolitically for everyone. And the tension comes when people in Delhi perceive American policy as essentially driving Russia into Chinese arms, whether it's through sanctions and so forth. So there is a degree to which Russia could be a bit of a balancer. I don't think a full-on balancer, but certainly more concern that China has to put towards Russia, I think, would be seen as positive geopolitically.
I just add, I mean, I think India wants, as Walter said, Russia to be a balancer vis-a-vis China, but you know, it would have recent developments would have given it pause, because the ideal Indian scenario would be that we'd see a kind of a repeat of the Cold War Sino-Soviet split, which benefited India tremendously. The India-Soviet partnership was based on China and Russia being adversaries, especially the kind of deeper one since the kind of 70s. And it has tried. So even as India has articulated its own Indo-Pacific approach, it's gone out of its way to try to say to Russia, we don't just have an Act East policy, we have an Act Far East policy. We want you to understand that our Indo-Pacific approach includes you. But you've seen in kind of at a government-run conference, Foreign Minister Lavrov say no, that it sees the Indo-Pacific as about containment of China and rejecting it. You've seen Putin just a couple of weeks ago at in a public event, not just talk about how great Chinese Sino-Russian ties are, highlighting the military aspect, particularly highlighting how Russian help has helped strengthen the PLA. He does not do these things accidentally. It's partly probably messaging to India. He did not take any questions from Indian participants. To send a message about trying to dissuade India from getting closer to the US, perhaps, but it does complicate India's hand, because while India is dependent on Russia for this equipment, for certain technologies that only the Russians provide, for spare parts for its existing equipment. It is kind of at the end of the day got to have at the back of its mind that if push comes to shove, would Russia, slow down supply or postpone supply of certain equipment to India because China asked them to? Why would they worry about that today? One, it's happened. It happened during the 1962 war. Second, they have noticed that Russia, for instance, is now coordinating in international institutions with the Chinese far more. You've seen this at the UN Security Council, where Russia is no longer the reliable partner for India, it's the US and France. And so I think that this would at least give India pause. And it has put Delhi in a real dilemma because you can't give up the relationship, but there are certain things about it that cause you more concern. And the answer you have, which is, the West needs to kind of stop pushing Russia, doesn't seem like it's going to be viable anytime soon, as long as also Russia behaves in a certain manner.
Right, I'm just going to interject for one moment and say that our panelists have very kindly agreed to stay until 15:15 to answer the additional questions. So thank you very much indeed. So to take from Christian, so has China's attempts to depict its authoritarian model as superior to democracy in responding to the virus worked, and I'll say here in India rather than internationally, in India, has it worked in India at all, or has it fallen flat?
I mean, Rudy's based.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, just to pitch in, I think the short answer is that if you're saying has it worked in India, it hasn't. I mean, that's the short answer, and clearly not. I mean, if anything, it has backfired in a way that I think very few in China would have even expected. I mean, the fact that India today is talking about a complete reset in its relationship with China is in fact quite strategically opposite to what anybody with the same mind in China could have expected. But here's another question, though. I wouldn't say it's the authoritarian model that has paid off in, say, South Asia. So let's subtract India, for instance. It's the economic model that has paid off. And that's very clear today. If you take the top 4 GDP producing South Asian states, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and maybe squeeze in Nepal, these are all 4 countries today that are dependent on Chinese financing. And not just BRI. There are many different ways in which the Chinese are financing these countries. There are Chinese liaison officers that sit inside ministries in these countries. There is increasingly an understanding in these countries that they don't want to get sandwiched between the US, India, China triangle. And I can see the book just behind Tanvi strategically placed over there. She's really the expert here. But if you're asking, is that economic model has worked? I mean, let's not fool ourselves. We keep talking about debt trap diplomacy. I'll be honest, this is not debt trap diplomacy. None of these countries are trapped willingly. They know what the arrangements are over here. In some cases, the debt outweighs the capital investment in a particular project, but I think that is hedged largely. The fact is that China is able to put tens of $billions into these countries when anybody else is finding it hard to put in $500 million into any of these countries.
I don't disagree with anything Rudy says, but I will say, I think because of the boundary crisis, people are too mad at China to be impressed by it on the kind of COVID side. And this is where I actually think where you have seen a model, even though it's not scalable to India's in many senses, Taiwan has really kind of had a kind of the Indian public didn't really know very much about Taiwan. It wasn't something that the Indian government talked about because they don't recognize it as a country, even though they engage with it. You didn't see, you never saw mention of it on TV. You're now seeing Indian newspapers openly print op-eds by Taiwanese ministers, even identifying them as ministers from the Republic of China. You have seen the Taiwanese send masks to India. You have seen just a few days ago, the Indian representative to Taiwan appear at a Taiwanese government-hosted Diwali party, and it was made public. These are things that are usually very low-key. But kind of, for every time somebody brings up China, people will either say, look, Taiwan is doing really well. It doesn't have the same model, or, New Zealand is doing well, or South Korea. So pointing out these other models that, yes, Europe and the US might have, and India might have, fallen short of kind of that democratic gold standards in handling COVID. But it's, I think you are seeing kind of these countervailing arguments about other democracies. And I think, with Taiwan, let's see if this lasts, but it could once we're out of kind of a COVID world, that you could potentially see it in terms of public awareness, tourism, connectivity, it benefit Taiwan in a longer way. And they've taken very good advantage of this window of opportunity.
So may I ask, so I just want to follow up on that just for a moment. So what lessons have they actually learned from Taiwan? So for example, if you were to ask most people in Britain or America or France or wherever, what like, okay, they've done really well. 500 people have died in South Korea, or under 500. Like most people don't have the, even really educated people, literally don't have the foggiest clue about how that has been achieved in any way, shape or form. So like what, and the lessons people have drawn from all of these things are not the lessons that people who really sort of look into the nitty gritty of public health have drawn on the whole. So like what lessons have been drawn? I'm just fascinated to know, like what lessons have been learned from Taiwan?
I mean, I can name at least, sorry, go ahead, Kabir.
No, go ahead, Rudy.
I mean,
you're there, so.
Three, I mean, whether you look at Taiwan, I mean, the power of technology, which has been incredible in Taiwan. I mean, we're still using PCR tests in most parts of the world that gives you a result in about 48 hours. They do a test that gives you a result in 3 hours. They have antigen testing that is more or less much more efficacious than what we have. In India, the antigen testing brings up many false negatives, and the efficacy is at about 50% in itself. Number 3, contact tracing and apps, right? Taiwan swiftly moved to an app kind of based contact tracing much faster than anybody else. It brought up a lot of questions on privacy, and I think that's a whole different debate. India tried an app, it didn't go through, but it's interesting though. It didn't go through in India because we have a judicial process. The court struck it down and said is you cannot force everybody to get on that app and to provide the details that they require. So when you walk into a hotel in Taiwan, if you don't have an app, you can't get in. If you walk into a hotel in India and somebody insists on the app, you can sue the hotel or take it to court.
A couple of others that I've mentioned. One is mask wearing, though that's kind of more the East Asian model. And the second is, I have heard some talk about kind of, because India put travel restrictions after countries like Taiwan did. But India's was much more targeted. It first started with China and then kind of went to East Asia and Southeast Asia. The flaw in that, which everybody's realized in hindsight couldn't have known, is that it ended up coming to India through Europe. And so, I think the first big cluster was from passengers from Italy. So this thing about, maybe kind of revisiting, having said that, India has, especially compared to Europe and the US, has a lot of experience on its own dealing with epidemics. And so, yes, there's some learning from outside, but I think one of the learnings is you don't have to be a non-democracy to be able to handle this well, because it has its own lessons. It's handled, and it has a whole structure. It has an epidemic intelligence service that deals with these things quite well. So it could have been much worse. But I think the broader thing is you don't have to be China to be able to handle it. And you have seen the Taiwanese government facilitating this interactions, which I think will be longer lasting, and putting in touch Indian medical professionals, healthcare professionals with Taiwanese counterparts. And so they've done these kind of lessons learned things. They do these video conferences that I think over time you could see that being a little bit more institutionalized. The one other space that I'd mention is this conversation about supply chain resilience. The Apple kind of subcontractors who are, for example, who have announced 3 of them, Apple's encouraging some of its, Foxconn and a couple of others to set up plants and diversify to India. But the Taiwanese have a lot of other companies that could potentially join that kind of flood. And that's one area which is not as sensitive as, say, some of the other spheres for India and Taiwan as well.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes left, and there are lots of questions, and we can email you the questions, and you can answer them at your leisure or as you see fit. I'd just like to give each of you just 30 seconds, just a short, crisp, like something that you think we should really take away from the key. What's your takeaway? So the key question is, in the post-COVID global order, what will India decide to do, and what is India able to do? So what do you want the audience to take away today from our actual exam question?
So I can give an answer that's maybe related. I think because India will recognize that it has certain constraints on its own capability, it will be more willing to work with like-minded partners and more willing to work. And you'll see a lot of this because other countries will see this as well. A lot of kind of issue or interest-based coalitions that will form, and India will participate in them, particularly ones that, and you will see a lot more democracies than not in them, particularly ones where you will see them kind of ranged up against China on the other side, and it will try to use these coalitions in turn to help build that capacity and capability in India.
I mean, the three quick ones I have is obvious. One, it will continue to rewire the relationship with China, and I think all eyes are on that. The key is how does it rewire the relationship? How does it benchmark the rewiring in itself? Number two, and this is closer to the question on Taiwan, India will build out health stack. So it will use its technological prowess and its allies and friends to essentially build up some kind of a digital transformation of health. I think that is the big takeaway for COVID. And it's worth keeping in mind is that India stands at the center of global manufacturing when it comes to vaccines. So no matter if it's the AstraZeneca vaccine in Oxford, for instance, about 200 million of those doses are going to be manufactured in Pune and so on and so forth. Number three, I think it will finally, in about 2022, as it takes the G20 or the chair of the G20, it will push for some kind of a self-styled version of data multilateralism, which will depart from what exists right now. And in my own sense, it will be successful because of the investments that would have already been tied into the Indian economy.
Walter or
yeah, I mean, I just make a quick point. I mean, just to build on some of the points that others made on the economy, I think in some sense, you know, COVID has created a political opportunity for the government to introduce economic reforms, liberalizing trade and agricultural products, freeing up businesses from very stringent labor regulations. But at the same time, we see a doubling down on import substitution on the trade side. And so I think, you know, one of the things that we're seeing is it's sort of like, you know, the dog is chasing the car, the dog has finally caught the car and now is a little bit unsure what to do and pulled in many different directions that we haven't yet seen, at least to my satisfaction, and I can speak for myself personally, a kind of economic blueprint for how to use this political opportunity that it actually has, that COVID has presented, to translate that into a kind of economic blueprint. Modi has a very clear vision about the end point, talking about the 5 trillion economy by 2024 and so on and so forth. But I'm afraid we still haven't really seen how point A connects to point B.
So I just answer by saying, I mean, first, I think that this delta between what India would like to do and what it's capable of doing, I think is real and will continue for some time. There will be a constraint of capacity and capability. And so while countries like the US and others sort of look to India as a partner and want India to do more to help out in the Indian Ocean or the broader Indo-Pacific, as Tanvi said, I think we're looking at partnerships and coalitions. So if it's, you know, France, UK, and India in the Western Indian Ocean into the Gulf region, or the partnerships that India is developing with Australia and then in conjunction with the United States. And I think everyone across the board is realizing, I think even the United States knows that it needs partners and allies to deal with the challenges ahead. So I think multilateralism and kind of small unit groupings, as Tanvi said, is definitely the way forward. The question is the degree of comfort, you know, once you start to try to move beyond talk shops and the Quad, written in lowercase letters, Tanvi, you know, what this is, when you try to go beyond a talk shop, when you start talking about, okay, developing routinization and comfort with interoperability, even in non-military scenarios, will India be there? Will India be willing to do the things that need to be done such that when or if a crisis were to occur, that these partnerships can be drawn upon in a meaningful way? I think for me is the enduring kind of open question.
So thank you all very much. I hope this has given the audience absolutely everything that they need to know about India and the post-COVID global order. So thank you very much. This really has been an absolutely brilliant session. Thank you very much indeed.